Hi Math 5-4. This is the video for lesson 116, which is located on page 537 and is scheduled for April 16th. As a reminder, week 11 homework is due this coming Monday, April 20th. Week 11 is this week, so it's lesson 116 is the final lesson on Thursday for week 11. Also, note that week 11, so that means we have week 11 homework, and we have week 12 homework next week, and then we have a final on April 27th, and then you're done. So we're getting really, really close. Lesson 116, we have 120 lessons we will do, plus one investigation, and then one final test. So you're getting very close to the end. I know you're all excited. Okay, let's get started. This lesson deals with common denominators, but let's do a little review first. Just as a reminder, when we write a fraction, the numerator is the top number, the denominator is the bottom number, okay? So what we're learning today is called a common denominator. So a common denominator means the denominators of two fractions or two or more fractions are the same or equal. So let's look at an example of that. Okay? If I have the fraction 1/3 and I have the fraction 2/3, they have a common denominator of 3. Both of their denominators are 3. So they have a common or equal denominator of 3. Okay? So using that, going forward, we're going to learn how to rename, or another word for rename that we have used on lesson 115 and before was equivalent fraction. So rename it to an equal fraction. Rename 3/4 and 5/6 so they have a common denominator of 12. Well, first let's look. Their current denominators are 4 and 6. So it does not have a common denominator. We're going to take those two fractions and give them a common denominator of 12. Let's look how we do that. So we write our fraction 3/4, and we know that we're going to somehow get that to be some number over 12. That is our common denominator we're looking for. In our other fraction, 5/6, we're going to do the same thing. We're going to set it up to give it some numerator and a common denominator of 12. Now, if we look at these two fractions, they will have a common denominator of 12 when we're done. We're not there yet, but when we're done, those two fractions we end up with will have a common denominator or an equal denominator of 12. So now we have to look at it and say, okay, we've done this before. We did this on lesson 115. What do I multiply 4 by to get to 12? Remember, I have to multiply both the top and the bottom by the same thing. So I know that I multiply 4 times 3. So I have to do that to the top. Okay. So 4 times 3 gives me 12. So 3 times 3 gives me 9. So one of my fractions is 9/12. 3/4 has been renamed to 9/12. Then I'm going to do the same thing. My original fraction is 5/6. I'm going to rename it to something 12ths. So again, I have to say, how do I get from 6 to 12? Well, I multiply it by 2, because 6 times 2 is 12. And I have to do the same thing to my numerator, okay? So it'll be 2 over 2. So 5 times 2 is 10. So when I rename 5/6, I get 10/12. Now if I look back at my problem, it wanted me to rename these two fractions so they would have a common denominator of 12. So when I rename 3/4 to 9/12, now I've renamed 5/6 to 10/12, and they have a common denominator of 12. Okay, so that is how you use common denominators. to find a common denominator for two or more fractions. Okay, so let's look at another one. Rename 2/3 and 3/4, so they have a common denominator of 12. The denominator won't always be 12. It just happens that on these two examples it is. So I set up my two fractions. 2/3 equals something over 12, and 3/4 equals something over 12. I get my over 12 from here, my common denominator of 12. So 3 times what number gives me 12? I know that it's times 4, and I have to do the same to my numerator. 2 times 4 is 8, so I have 8/12 over here. And then 4 times some number is 12. I know that number is 3, and so I have to do the same to my numerator. And 3 times 3 is 9, so I have 9/12. So my answers are 8/12. 2/3 has been renamed to 8/12, and 3/4 has been renamed to 9/12, and they have a common denominator of 12. Both of them have 12 as their denominator. Okay? All right. So now, going on to the next step, we will use that information and we will find, for two fractions, their least common denominator. Okay, least we always know means smallest. It's kind of a word that's more common for us to use. And we know a common denominator means both of them have it, or common or equal or same. So the smallest denominator, they can both have the same denominator, the smallest one. Okay, so to find that, we use the least common multiple. Remember, when I talk about multiple, I always tell you when you hear multiple, think multiply. We multiply by the counting numbers to get our multiples. Okay, to give the fractions a common denominator. So that's a lot of words. Let's look at the math of it. So if we are going to rename 1/2 and 2/3 using their least common denominator. Okay, let's see what that means. So when I think least common denominator, I know that I need their least common multiple. And in order to get that, I have to write out their multiples. So the first step is find that least common denominator using multiples. Okay, so let's see. Our first step, so I wrote out the multiples because my denominators are 2 and 3 in my original problems. So I wrote out their multiples. 2 times 1 is 2, 2 times 2 is 4, 2 times 3 is 6, 2 times 4 is 8, 2 times 5 is 10, and I stopped there. And then for 3, the multiples, remember multiply by the counting numbers. 3 times 1 is 3, 3 times 2 is 6, 3 times 3 is 9, 3 times 4 is 12, 3 times 5 is 15. And I could keep going and come up with more. In fact, I'm going to go one more, if I can find my marker here. And I was supposed to go one more there. Okay, so if I look for common multiples, when I look for common multiples, I see that there's a 12 in common. And I kind of make a little funny circle that encompasses them both. And let's see, there's a 6 in common. And that's all I see in common of their multiples. So a common multiple means they both have it. But I'm looking for one particular type of multiple, their least. I'm looking for the least, so the smallest. So I'm not going to use 12. I'm not going to use it, so I'll just mark through it. I'm not using that. Okay? I'm going to use 6 because that's the smallest of their multiples. Okay, so I know that my least common denominator is going to be 6. My least common denominator is going to be used as my least my least common multiple, 6, is going to be used as my least common denominator. So let's, I did not write it out. Okay, good. We'll write it out now. So my original fraction, let's go, okay? So that's step 1, is we found our least common denominator is 6. Now now that we have that, that's the new step right here. Now that we have that, it's something you've done before. Okay, so this right here is your new step in finding your least common denominator. Now that we have that, we go back to what we have been doing the whole lesson. We set up our original fraction, 1/2 equals something, and I'm going to use my 6 as my common denominator, the least common denominator. Okay, I'm going to set up my other original fraction with a denominator of 6. Okay, so this is something we've done before. So once you have found that multiple, that's your new step. That's the only new part. This you're experts at. Okay, so I know, let me get a different colored pen so you can see it well. 2 times some number will give me 6. I know that number has to be 3. And 1 times 3 will give me 3. So 1/2 gets rewritten as 3/6, or renamed as 3/6. Okay, so I go to my next one. 3 times some number will give me 6. I know that number has to be 2. So I have to do that to the top and the bottom. 2 times 2 will give me 4. So 2/3 is renamed to 4/6. So your answer to your problem is 3/6 and 4/6. Okay, so your practice problems for this lesson will have a combination. They'll have the first part I showed you, which is just like my example 1 and 2, which is just asking you to rename them with a common denominator. So there's 2 problems like this. Okay, rename it, common denominator. It gives you the denominator. You just have to plug in the numbers and find out that missing number right here. But it gives you everything else. So there'll be a couple problems like that in your practice problems. And then there will be 4 of the least common denominator problems. I use least common denominator and least common multiple. They're practically the same thing in this instance. Okay, so then the 4 of them will involve this. And remember, this is your new step. Whereas on these problems, it gave you rename these 2 fractions so they have a common denominator of 12. This one's saying, yeah, rename them, and you have to find your own common denominator. When it says using their least common denominator, you have to find that when it's that type of problem. So there's 4 of them that will use the multiples to find your common denominator. Okay, so that is, let's see, lesson practice is page 538. Lesson practice problems. Okay, and so that is the end of the videos for week 11. As a reminder, the homework will be due Monday. And I hope you all have a wonderful weekend and that you're doing well. Bye.